The name is Jim von Braun, and he's so sick and tired of the high interest rates, which have created a recession, rendering him unemployed and desperate. As far as he's concerned, one man is responsible for his misfortune. Paul Adolf Volcker, the chairman of the almighty American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. Von Braun believes the Fed is an illegitimate organization controlled by a certain group of people with agenda, and he will put an end to it. The Federal Reserve is a highly secure place. After reaching the ground floor, Jim von Braun gets into a fight with security guards. Jim von Braun quickly realizes he's outnumbered. He's then disarmed, arrested, and sent to jail. In the late 1970s, inflation sits at a whopping 12%. If left unchecked, it will inevitably go out of control, and it could be the end of American capitalism. Ever since Paul Volcker decided to raise the interest rates, he knew it would be a tough fight. And after almost getting taken hostage, he's reminded of just how real that fight is.
I don't believe it would have been possible without a man of Paul Volcker's stature, who understood the business of central banking from soup to nuts, who understood the costs of not dealing with inflation.
From a broken economy with inflation run wild, Paul Volcker is the man who restored the credibility of the United States, setting the stage for decades of new growth. He is the man who saved America. During the 19th century, America becomes an industrial superpower, thanks to the work and ingenuity of entrepreneurs like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. But as different parts of the economy become more connected, a flaw in the system becomes evident. The United States was built on the principle of decentralization, where each state was given considerable power and autonomy. Unlike the rest of the Western countries like Netherlands and the UK at the time, America had no central bank. Such a system worked well for America during a time when banks were relatively isolated and small. The failure of one bank typically had minimal effect on other banks from different states. There was no need for a central bank until 1907. During the Panic of 1907, banks start to feel like dominoes. When one group of clients start withdrawing money from their banks, other clients of other banks become suspicious of their banks as well.
The Panic of 1907 was the straw that broke the camel's back. The U.S. is the biggest economy in the world. Americans are saying, gee, other countries with central banks are not having so many financial crises. Why are we?
After barely surviving the crash, the U.S. government devises a plan to prevent the next financial crisis. They realize that in the event that banks fail like dominoes, there should be an agency with virtually unlimited amount of money to lend to those banks. This agency should become the bank of last resort. It turns out the biggest borrower won't be banks, but the US government. By lending to banks and to the government, the Fed controls the amount of money in the system. But the Federal Reserve couldn't just print all the money they wanted. There's a requirement to have at least 40% of US dollars backed by gold, the so-called gold standard. But the Federal Reserve typically held more than 40% gold, which gave it room to control the supply of money. The gold standard has worked well in many countries for decades, but like what happened to America, the world itself has become a one giant economy that is increasingly connected. As America becomes the world's leader, a new system will emerge. The 20th century is the American century. After the decline of the Great Britain, a new order is in place. And the US dollar replaces the British pound as the world's reserve currency. And this new world is a drastically different game, requiring a new set of rules.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
In 1944, a new global currency system is invented. From now on, only the US dollar will be linked to gold, while the rest of the world's currencies will be linked to the US dollar. The Federal Reserve now has practically become the central bank to the world. Now there's a very troublesome conflict of interest with this setup. For the US Fed, there's a guideline to stimulate employment. So if the Fed lowers interest rates to boost employment, it may cause inflation, which violates the Bretton Woods Agreement. To stimulate employment, the Fed ignores the Bretton Woods Agreement and starts supplying the economy with a lot of liquidity, i.e. printing money. In the short term, nothing negative happens, and America enjoys a prosperous decade of the 1950s. And it goes on to the early 1960s while the employment is stable and inflation is low.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat president, became overly ambitious, thinking that the government could do anything. So he started a series of social programs called the Great Society, which required a lot of government spending. But there's no free lunch. Johnson's Great Society program and his war in Vietnam sends the government's budget sky high. It in turn pushes the price level in the US to an unprecedented level. To bring the prices down, Federal Reserve is ready to raise the interest rates by selling more treasury bills, thus reducing the amount of money in the system. While goods and services in the economy stay relatively unchanged, the reduction of overall money in the system means reducing prices. It is only reasonable for the Fed chairman Bill Martin to do so again this time. But the rate hike means it will be more expensive for businesses to borrow money, likely creating a short-term recession. And President Lyndon Johnson will not let that happen. The Federal Reserve was established to be independent. But to ensure that his Great Society program succeeds, Lyndon Johnson starts applying pressure on the Fed to not raise interest rates, until Chairman Martin gives in.
We've talked for a long time about the independence of the Federal Reserve. That's independence within the government, not independence of the government.
The Fed starts printing more money that can be backed by gold, effectively breaking the Bretton Woods Agreement. And finally, President Nixon makes it official.
Now, this action will not win us any friends among the international money traders. But our primary concern is with the American workers. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Removing the gold standard essentially gave the Fed even more power to control the money, not just in America, but the world. By breaking the promise established by the Bretton Woods Agreement, the United States loses its credibility. Now it's up to the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, to restore that trust in the dollar. But just like his predecessor Martin, Burns also caves in because of the political pressure, especially the pressure coming from Nixon.
Political pressures would grow. Where did they come from? They came from Congress, they came from the administration, they came from the business community, they came from the labor unions, and it was just very hard to resist. The whole climate of opinion was against them.
By the end of the 1970s, the US dollar has lost half of its value, with inflation sitting at a whopping 12%.
The question is, how long will this go on? Inflation running out of control. The answer? Probably for years.
After Arthur Burns, President Carter appointed a new chairman, G. William Miller, from the private sector. Hiring Miller just made it even worse. As a businessman turned Fed chairman, he was even more reluctant about raising the interest rates, which could create a short-term recession. So everyone at the Fed got together and threw him out. President Carter has very little options left. He needs to find a replacement for the Fed chairman fast. He knows this decision will either make or break the American economy. Paul Adolf Volcker is from a well-off political family in New Jersey. Volcker's father is an accomplished township manager, and the young Volcker dreams of following his father's footsteps into politics. His father was famous for his ability to run the government budget efficiently. That, along with the fact that he was born during the Great Depression, really instilled a great capacity for Volcker to manage money conservatively and live frugally. Volcker graduates from Princeton with honors because of his excellent thesis on the Federal Reserve policies. Volcker then gets his master's degree in political economy from Harvard University. With the degrees from prestigious schools, Paul Volcker's career blossoms. In a span of 2 decades, he goes from a financial economist for Chase Manhattan Bank to working in the Treasury Department during Nixon's administration. And then he gets promoted to the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1975. In October 1979, consumer price inflation is running at over 12%. And after the humiliating exile of Fed Chairman G. William Miller, President Carter has his back against the wall. He realizes there's a crisis of confidence. He needs to find a new chairman who has what it takes to do the hard things, even if that may cost him his second term as president. And that new chairman is Paul Volcker. By 2022, inflation has come back, with consumer prices holding at 9.1% from the previous year. This has left many Americans worried about the future, because at this rate, the dollars you stuff under your mattress will lose half of their value by 2030. In 1975, the Federal Reserve Board started Fine Arts program to improve the working environment of the Fed. But surprisingly, the value of fine arts also turns out to be a great hedge against inflation. And this reputation has only grown over the years, with Bank of America's chief investment strategist recently recommending investing in real assets. He believes that in eras when bonds and stocks struggle, real assets have provided superior risk-adjusted returns. And according to historical data, when inflation is over 3%, art beats gold, real estate, and S&P 500. As a result, real assets like art are quickly becoming essential to a balanced portfolio. Personally, I would love to allocate a portion of my income to alternative assets to generate more diversified returns. But investing in fine art has had a really high bar of entry, only available to millionaire and billionaire investors. That's until I found Masterworks, the unicorn investment platform. Now I can just pull up Masterworks' site and invest, choosing from a catalog of offerings backed by physical, multi-million-dollar art. With inflation through the roof, demand for Masterworks has skyrocketed, but anybody who uses my Phineas link gets priority access to their platform. To skip the waitlist and join the 500,000 other members of Masterworks, I highly recommend you check out that link in the description of this video. After his appointment, Volcker becomes the world's most powerful central banker, with the tools and weapons to deal with inflation head-on. Volcker understands that a big part of inflation has to do with expectations rather than reality.
The most important factor over the long haul has been changing not wiser monetary policy, but a monetary policy focused on anchoring inflation expectations. On the one hand, if inflation expectations are very well anchored, then policy can relatively easily succeed in keeping inflation at target, and vice versa. If policy is committed to keeping inflation near target, then inflation expectations tend to be well anchored.
So if the market received the signal that inflation will be dealt with, it may stop expecting more inflation, and companies may become more hesitant about raising prices of their products. Volcker announces that the Fed will enact a never-before-seen policy to curb the supply of money rather than focusing on raising the interest rates. It's a clever play of words because those two things are essentially the same. But Volcker knows that a fierce-sounding new policy will get the public's attention. It will signal that the Fed really means business.
You know, you can't deal with that problem by simply saying we're going to let inflation go ahead.
Volcker knows solving the inflation will come at a tremendous short-term cost to the economy. But what he doesn't know is that it may also cost his own life. Even after nearly escaping from being taken hostage, Volcker's nightmare has only just begun.
It was a very tough period, and there's a lot of opposition, and no doubt about it. And then somebody got the idea of sending in all these sawed-up 2x4s.
Home builders sent Volcker their protests scrolled on wooden planks.
Within the first 2 years, Volcker's fat actions have caused a severe drop in employment. It puts Volcker at the center of attack by all fronts. Even the famous economist Milton Friedman predicts that Volcker will fail catastrophically. And by 1983, Friedman seems to be right, as the US economy falls into a full-blown recession. And President Carter loses his second presidential bid to Ronald Reagan. He really personifies stoicism. It's hard to imagine the kind of pressure he was under when everyone was trying to stop him. Even with pressure coming from everywhere and everyone, Paul Volcker decides to keep at it, raising the interest rates to an incredible height, at some point crossing 20%.
Neither he, nor I, nor anyone else had any idea of how high the interest rate was going to be. He told me, I never thought we'd have to go to 20%. But he did. That took courage.
Inflation is reduced by half during Volcker's first 3 years as the Fed chairman. And it keeps on falling into the rest of the decade, as the country enters a stage of prosperity like never before.
Paul Volcker has advised me of his decision not to accept a third term as a member and chairman of the Federal Reserve Board.
With inflation tamed, Paul Volcker decides not to pursue a third term.
He could have served as the Fed chairman a lot longer, and there were speculations about other reasons why he quit. Reagan's presidency is an era of consumerism and easy money. It's about deregulation. Paul Volcker, on the other hand, as a Democrat, believes in regulating financial companies from becoming too big to fail.
By the mid-1980s, the credibility of the United States has been restored. The economy is in perfect state to embrace the third industrial revolution, the age of information. But all of that may not have been possible without the intelligence and perseverance of Paul Volcker.
Nice that we have leaders who step up and do the right thing now and then, take a long-term view. We could use more of it.
But after the retirement of Paul Volcker, a completely different kind of man comes into power.